תודה רבה לשר החוץ. פתיחה הולמת ליום הזה. אז נעשה רגע שנייה אישור קו לגבי היום. בסך הכל היום לפי התכנון הוא יום שאנחנו עוסקים יותר בסביבה האזורית במעגלים השונים, כולל במעגל הבינלאומי והשפעתו כמובן על התהליכים והאירועים שמתרחשים כאן במזרח התיכון. אני רוצה רגע שנייה להעיר שתי הערות, כי שאלו אותי אנשים שהסתובבנו בהפסקות, שאלו אותי שתי שאלות שחזרו על עצמן ואני רוצה רגע שנייה להתייחס אליהן. אתמול בבוקר שהצגנו את הנושא הפלסטיני, שגילי הציג את התפיסה של תוכנית מדינית של מספר מסלולים, הרעיון המרכזי של התוכנית הזאת היה שאנחנו צריכים לשים תוכנית מדינית שאפשר להתקדם איתה לכיוון היעד של שני מדינות לשני עמים, והייתה לנו גם הצגה של התוכנית הביטחונית שהציגו אותה צ'יקו תמיר. התוכנית הביטחונית הזאת דרך אגב שהוצגה היא מתאימה לכל המסלולים, זה הייחודיות שלה, זה לא היה ברור, אז אני רוצה להדגיש את העניין הזה, כי שאלו אותי בנושא הזה מה לגבי המסלול הזה או המסלול אחר. עמדנו דרך אגב המכון אצלנו שאנחנו מעלים רעיון, אנחנו לא רק מדברים עליו, אנחנו חוקרים אותו ומתכננים אותו. אנחנו תכננו את התוכנית, גם את התוכנית המדינית וגם את התוכנית הביטחונית, ובתכנון עלה לנו דבר מאוד מעניין שהמענה הביטחוני מתאים לכל המסלולים שעליהם דיברנו אתמול, ולכן אנחנו חושבים שזה מענה הולם ומענה מספיק חזק כדי להתמודד עם הדברים. זה דבר אחד. דבר שני, נשאלתי אם יגיע היום השר בנט, אז השר בנט כפי שאמרתי אתמול בגלל האבל על מותו של השר אורי אורבך החליט שהיומיים הקרובים אין פעילות פוליטית, ולכן מי ששמח או מי שעצוב כל אחד לגישתו, הוא לא יגיע הערב, הוא לא יציג את דבריו. אני חושב שגם התרשמנו קצת אתמול מי ענה לנו על השאלות ששאלנו, ואתם יכולים לעשות את ההשוואה דרך אגב באופן עקרוני בין הדברים של שר הביטחון ושר החוץ שהזמנו אותם מתוקף תפקידים מובילים בתחום הביטחון הלאומי, לבין בעצם הבמה שנתנו לראשי המפלגות לדבר על הבחירות ולדבר על הפוליטיקה, וזה לא אותו דבר. אנחנו מסתכלים על האתגרים ומה המענה לאתגרים שלנו. יש לנו איזו הפתעה מסוימת היום, אני אשמור לכם אותה למרות שהיא מופיעה בתוכנית, אבל זו הפתעה מאוד מעניינת. ולכן מאחר והזמן קצר והמלאכה מרובה, ולפעמים יש איזו תחושה כמעט של תפסת מרובה לא תפסת, כי אנחנו רוצים להקיף כל כך הרבה נושאים והימים קצרים, אז אנחנו הולכים מיד לנושא הבא שזה הנושא האיראני, נושא מאוד מרכזי בימים האחרונים, ויש לנו פה שורה של מומחים שיעסקו בנושא הזה. שיהיה יום מוצלח לכולם ונתראה בערב.
به خوبی اجرا بشه به معنای این است که یک گام به سمت اعتماد ما جلو گذاشتیم.
Initially, the sides exhibited optimism, though they were unable to meet the deadline for a final deal, November 24, 2014. Now, well into the extension of the negotiating period, disagreements remain.
For the Gulf states, this is their nightmare scenario, that the Americans and the Iranians are going to come to a deal and it will all come at their expense.
בראיית האיראנים, מה שמוטל על הכף זה מאוד בעייתי מבחינתם. קודם כל זה הגנת עתידו של החיזבאללה. ב' זה אין ספק שכל הפסד בסוריה יצמצם את רמת ההשפעה האיראנית בכל מקום.
As the world looks forward to a denouement to this decade-long ordeal, the question of what kind of deal arises. In the past, Israeli leaders have questioned whether a bad deal was better than no deal. As we near the final phases of negotiations, it seems appropriate to ask, has the world accepted a nuclear Iran?
Okay. I think you can sit down and I'll do this in a minute. Good morning to everyone. Welcome to the Iran panel, which I will be conducting this morning in English, because that is the language of 3 of our 4 distinguished panelists, who I will introduce in a few minutes. I want to begin by just setting the stage a little bit before our discussion. And I want to say that in recent weeks, of course, the Iranian nuclear issue has obviously been overshadowed by the dispute over Prime Minister Netanyahu's intention to speak before Congress in 2 weeks' time. And all I want to say about this at this point is that when thinking about how this dynamic has unfolded, I think we need to keep in mind that both Netanyahu and President Obama made a decision, one on how to act and one on how to react, and that there were a range of options for each leader with regard to their respective decision. And at this point, I think both sides need to work very hard to get things back on track. It's in the interest of both countries. I'll probe this somewhat with the panelists, but I do not want it to overshadow our discussion either. And therefore, I would like to focus my very brief and telegraphic opening remarks on the issue itself, and primarily on the negotiations dynamic in the P5+1 Iran nuclear talks over the course of the past year. And I want to start by saying that my criticism of the process so far is because I think the P5+1 could be bargaining more effectively. What I'm missing here is more effective negotiation strategies that could perhaps get a better result. So I would not adhere to the proposition that even if the negotiation is not going well, or we feel it's not going well, that the alternative, which is often presented as being either Iran rushing to a bomb or war, is worse, and therefore we must simply be patient. What I would argue is that the alternative that I'm at least focused on is a different one. It's the alternative of a more effective negotiation strategy that would increase the chance, perhaps, of the P5+1 getting the good deal that they would like. I want to say a word on the joint plan of action, the interim deal that was secured in late 2013, and which at the time was presented as being only in order to buy time for the negotiation on the comprehensive deal. Comprehensive deal was always referred to as the only agreement that really mattered. But now the JPOA is being hailed as a landmark agreement that has frozen and even rolled back Iran's program. And what I would like to point out is that the interim deal is also, unfortunately, enabling Iran to move dangerously forward on its nuclear program. And in this regard, I would note in particular, first, its continued research and development into more and more advanced generations of centrifuges, which will spin many times faster than the ones they're currently using. And therefore, the advanced centrifuges are a kind of functional equivalent of 20% enriched uranium. These are different routes to the same goal of maintaining a quick breakout to a nuclear capability. Second, Iran's ongoing lack of cooperation with the IAEA on questions regarding Iran's weaponization activities, which are the heart of the matter here, and they're not covered by the interim deal. Iran has paid no price over the past year for stonewalling, for continuing to stonewall the IAEA on a whole list of questions that the agency has with regard to Iran's possible military activities. And third, of course, is Iran's continued work on the delivery system. Nuclear weapons need a delivery system, and Iran has a vast and varied ballistic missile program, again, not covered by the interim deal. Iran just launched a satellite. Everyone knows that that's also an indication of technology needed for ballistic missiles. Other problematic issues regard the fact that Iran continues to hold on to a vast stockpile of low-enriched uranium, which, if it is enriched to the higher levels needed for nuclear weapons, would be enough for about 6 to 7 nuclear devices. Again, this stockpile is not dealt with in the interim deal. What has transpired over the past 13 months of negotiations? Very briefly, what we have seen most is ongoing defiance and intransigence on the part of Iran, alongside rhetoric from the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, and very often Rouhani as well, that expresses contempt, disdain, and hatred for the United States, not to mention Israel. And alongside this, there are some worrisome indications of a willingness on the part of the P5+1 to offer concessions that indicate clearly that they are beginning to back away from some of their previously held demands. One issue, of course, is the number of centrifuges. Last year, we heard very clearly that the demand of the international negotiators was that Iran would have no more than around the order of 1,500 to 2,000 centrifuges. Over the course of the negotiations, this number rose to 4,500, recently, of course, to 6,500, and some reports that the number might be even higher. The P5+1 are also no longer demanding to close facilities at Iraq, the reactor at Iraq, or the enrichment facility in Fordow. And I will be asking Ambassador Dennis Ross about additional P5+1 concessions, because he has written about this in a recent piece. The concern here is what all of this means for the negotiations dynamic, because this negotiation is fundamentally a game of compellence toward Iran. Remember, there is no shared interest here. Iran wants to keep its breakout capability to nuclear weapons. The international community would like Iran to return to the bounds of its NPT commitments. So the name of the game here is pressure and leverage. Harsh sanctions from 2012 brought Iran back to the table in 2013, and this is what must be used effectively in the negotiation in order to press Iran to agree to the deal that the P5+1 want. So the P5+1 commitment to negotiations is fine, it's admirable. But if Iran senses that the P5+1 are overly eager for a deal, or that they're loath to declare the negotiations a failure and to threaten real consequences in the face of ongoing Iranian intransigence, this unfortunately translates into a weaker bargaining position for the P5+1. A word on the internal US debate, and this is my last comment. I would point out that in addition to the sanctions, the whole debate over sanctions legislation, which of course has become relatively muted in the last couple of weeks, there has been what I find to be, and I'm going to probe this with the panelists, a noteworthy shift in the debate that I think reflects growing concerns about the direction of the negotiation. And I'll just point out a very important, to my mind, op-ed that was published in the Washington Post earlier this month, quoting concerns of important people like George Shultz and Henry Kissinger. More and more questions are being raised in recent weeks about US policy, including growing concerns that are being voiced in the context of the US debate, that this is perhaps about a shifting US strategy towards Iran more generally, with the administration perhaps beginning to view Iran more as an anchor of stability in the Middle East, and the state perhaps most aligned actually with US regional interests. And I'm putting a big question mark here, and something I do want to probe. I will stop here and move to introduce our distinguished panelists. So, we have with us this morning, indeed, a distinguished panel. First, Ambassador Dennis Ross. He's counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior to returning to the Washington Institute in 2011, Dennis served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Clinton. His experience at senior levels of policymaking, of course, started long before the Obama era. As our audience well knows, for years, Dennis played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process and dealing directly with the parties in negotiations. And I think I remember that this goes back to the ACRS talks, the Arms Control and Regional Security talks from the early 1990s. He, of course, brings to our discussion his rich experience in Washington, his acquaintance with key personalities making decisions on the Iranian issue. Welcome, Dennis. Dr. Tamara Wittes is a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November 2009 to January 2012. She was central to organizing the U.S. government's response to the Arab awakening. Like Dennis, she brings a Washington experience both from inside the administration, looking out, and from outside looking in. Welcome, Tamara. Dr. Ray Takeyh is Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing on Iran, Islamic movements, political reforms in the Middle East. He is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and author most recently of Guardians of the Revolution, Iran and the World in the Age of the Ayatollahs. Dr. Takeyh was born in Iran and has followed Iran, the nuclear program, and the P5+1 negotiations for years, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts, Ray. I understand this is your first trip to Israel, so Baruch haba. And finally, someone very well known to this audience, Brigadier General Reserve Yosef Kuperwasser, who served from 2011 until December 2014 as Director General of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. For 35 years, Yossi served in the IDF in a variety of intelligence-related roles, including as intelligence officer in Central Command, IDF attaché for intelligence affairs in Washington, and head of the research division of military intelligence. He has extensive experience in dealing with the Iranian nuclear issue, and is here. The Israeli perspective is all on your shoulders, Yossi, so welcome. So Ray, I want to start with you, because I'm going to try to go a little bit thematically, starting with what perhaps is an emerging deal, then we're going to talk about the dynamics of the negotiation a bit, and then we'll move to some other issues. So, if indeed a deal is emerging, do you think this is a good deal, bad deal, mediocre deal? And I want to also ask you to relate in your answer to some of the issues that I know that you have drawn particular attention to, for example, the clandestine facilities that might be in Iran, the secret facilities. And do you have a sense that all of the issues that you view as important to this comprehensive deal are being covered in the negotiations?
Thanks. I hope everyone can hear me on my first trip to Israel. I would say about a prospective deal, and I shouldn't note that I don't know all its technical ingredients, and it is going to be a technical deal. But if you're kind of looking at the parameters, one can say that these parameters are, at this particular stage, rather permissive. Particularly so, I think, the notion that an agreement would have an expiration clause. And I understand when they first thought about the expiration clause, they thought in terms of 3 decades, then it became 25 years, then it became 20 years, then it became 15 years, and by July it's not going to be 15 years. So that actually is probably the most problematic aspect of it. The second is the notion that enlarged enrichment capacity can be mitigated by having Iran ship out substantial quantities of its fuel. If I give you a big car, you got a big car. Now, how much gas is in it can be mitigated over time, but it's still a big car. Finally, about clandestine aspect of it, I mean, you don't know what you don't know. If Iranians don't have a clandestine facility, it will be the first time in 20 years that they haven't had a clandestine facility. So it's case law. It's establishing a precedent. And if they can move to an industrial-sized program after expiration of a sunset clause, I don't believe there's an inspection modality that can essentially verify that incremental violation of the agreement are not taking place. And if you have high-velocity centrifuges operating at great speed and efficiency, then the possibility of having a parallel clandestine program become greater. So those are some of the parameters of the agreement and some aspects of it. As I said, I don't know all the technical details, but it does seem we're not where we thought we would be, and perhaps we're not where we ought to be.
Thank you. Before we continue, we do have a question that is supposed to come up for the audience to text message their answers to. Here it is. Does Israel have a viable option to oppose an agreement brokered between the P5+1 and Iran? I would ask you to text your answer as just a number, not using words, just 1 or 2. And when we get towards the end of the panel, we will see, we'll go back to this to see some results. Okay? We'll continue. So Dennis, first of all, I would like your thoughts also on the first question, but I also want you to probe the negotiations dynamic a little bit more. The issue of the concessions that you feel are being made by the P5+1. I'm referring to an article that you published last October. And also, if you can relate to the idea that I know that you had raised in the past of the kind of take it or leave it deal that could be presented to Iran. In other words, to get the best deal possible as far as the P5+1 is concerned, present that to Iran in this kind of, if they take it, good. If not, we'll know that we need to be doing something else. And whether that is any longer relevant in the context of the negotiations that are now taking place. So I know that's a lot, but...
Yeah, so maybe what I'll do is I'll focus on what I want to focus on.
Okay, that's good.
Look, I think we could sit up here for a long time and say what would have been the best negotiating tactics to have pursued. We are where we are. The idea that you can recreate the tactics when you're already at a certain place, I think, is an illusion. So I think we ought to take a look at what's likely to emerge, and is it something you can accept or you can't accept, and how do you make it acceptable? If you really try to understand, I think, the essence of the disagreement between where the administration is today and where the Prime Minister is, it comes down to the administration is negotiating a deal that it believes is the best alternative that's available because it thinks for, say, 15 years it can put a limitation on the Iranian program. It can have a 1-year breakout time that can be detected and we can act on if we discover something, and that there's no other vehicle today that gives you a better alternative than that. I think the position of the Prime Minister is that this deal will allow Iran to emerge as a nuclear threshold state. And as a nuclear threshold state, and this is kind of an implication of what Ray was getting at, you have a large program, particularly because Iran, after the life of the agreement, let's say it's 15 years, can build an industrial-sized program, and the larger the program, the harder for transparency to work, particularly if the transparency is built around a set of rules that assumes a small program. So is there a way to bridge the gap between the two? And I think the answer is potentially yes, and there's two ways that you could do it. First is the character of transparency. It is not only that you have to have a transparent regime that allows you anywhere, anytime for declared and undeclared facilities, but you're also going to have to come up with a new set of protocols and means that work for a program that could have tens of thousands of centrifuges and not just for 1,000 or 2. It's not the same. What you do to ensure that you can verify a program that has 1,000 or 2 centrifuges is dramatically less than what is required if you have tens of thousands, and you'd have to come up with an approach that allows you a high level of confidence that you can cover that. So that's one element. The second element is you have to be very clear in what the consequences are for every class of violations. And you can't wait until you face the violation to then decide what that's going to be. You actually should work that out now. It should be now, and frankly, the one place where the administration could do something with the Congress at a time when the Congress has made it clear it wants to put its imprint on this is on agreeing to what the consequences of violation will be in advance. If, for example, you catch the Iranians in what amounts to a move for a dash, and this gets at, again, something that Ray was sort of implying, you know, if this deal is going to be one where the Iranians are allowed large numbers of centrifuges and all they have to do is repipe them, and if you catch them repiping, then there has to be an explicit consequence. If it involves moving in a dash form to trying to break out, that consequence should be the use of force. There should be there should be a legislation worked out with the Hill in advance that says, if we catch them in the following kind of violation, the implication is we are going to take out those facilities. That would deter the Iranians. That would go a long ways towards addressing one of the basic Israeli concerns. I think the Israeli concerns as it relates to a threshold nuclear state are twofold. One, if you acquiesce to that, it already sends a signal to the Iranians that you're going to live with them being in a position where they're close to having a nuclear weapons capability, and at a time of their choosing, they're likely to move and assume they can get away with it. If they know that they can be detected if they do it, and if they know that, in fact, that's going to trigger the use of force, it's likely to deter them in the first place, and it goes a long ways towards addressing what is, I think, the core of the Israeli concern. So it seems to me the focus should be on, can you live with a threshold nuclear state or not, and what would be the way to be able to do that? I've suggested two ways based on transparency and based on making very clear the consequences for violations of agreement that move you in that direction. One last point. You also make it clear, the administration has said we are against Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state. And this agreement will allow us to ensure they won't be. At the end of the lifetime of the agreement, the same principle should apply. We are against Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state. If the gap is here, from here to there, if we see them moving, the same thing applies. All options are on the table. When we have legislation that says if they move in that direction, it triggers the use of force, same thing applies after life of an agreement.
Thank you so much for that. I was going to move directly to you, but I actually want first to get Yosef's reaction to that proposal. Is that something that you think would work for Israel?
Unfortunately, no. I don't think it's going to work for Israel because I think we cannot trust the Iranians. We trust them to be very cunning and very capable to bypass all these obstacles, and what they would learn from readiness of the Americans to accept them as a threshold state would be that what drives the Americans is the fear of having to do anything militarily. And that means that they would not take seriously the second advice of Ambassador Ross. That they would not believe that they really mean business. And this would mean that they would continue to move forward cautiously, but continuously. And in the end of the day, they would be that close that by the time the American intelligence and the rest of the intelligence organizations will really know that something is happening, there's going to be a bomb. But we saw it in North Korea. It already happened. So how can we go in this way? But the problem we have is much deeper than that. The entire way we see the Iranian problem is different between the Israeli establishment and the American establishment. I'm saying it's not about the prime ministers and the leaders. The entire establishment see differently the problem. People tend to turn it into something personal. This is not personal. The entire Israeli establishment looks at this issue as a strategic threat that may turn into an existential threat for the state of Israel. And as such, our goal is to make sure that the Iranians are not a threshold state, or that the threshold is such that the Iranians themselves realize that any attempt to cross the threshold is too dangerous for the survival of the regime. That's the situation where we should be. And unlike us, the Americans look at it in a different way. They definitely also don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, that's obvious. But they can afford something like 1 year threshold, believing that this is enough. This is not enough. They believe that this is a threshold that can be sustained because, in their view, Iran is not that terrible. It's terrible, but not that terrible. They make the difference between ultra radicals and ultra radicals, and they want to focus on the ultra radicals. And the ultra radicals can be helpful in fighting the ultra radicals, and because of that, it's not the end of the world. And that is the deepest difference. And because of that, we have a totally different approach. We think that the way to, and coming back to what Ambassador Rose was saying, we think that the way to treat the Iranians, because the West is much, much stronger, the way to treat the Iranians is not through offering them all kinds of prizes, but through coercion. The combination of denying them the capability to move forward, together with political isolation and economic sanctions and a credible military option, all of that should force the Iranians to give up this program. And it can be done. And this is what's at stake today. Because it's not only Israel, many others believe that this is what should be done. Now, the administration is moving towards a deal that is extremely dangerous. It's not only the 6,000 centrifuges, which is unbelievable. Nobody would even raise this figure a year ago. It's a nightmare. But it's also the question of what's going to happen to the Ray said correctly that it's a matter of details, but what's going to happen to the infrastructure of the other 14,000 centrifuges? If this infrastructure is not going to be totally dismantled, this puts Iran in a situation where within within weeks, it can reinstall all those centrifuges. What's going to happen with that? So it's extremely dangerous. And what's going to happen with the PMD? And what's going to happen with the ballistic missiles? And what's going to happen with the amount of enriched uranium that they're going still to have? And what's going to happen with the problems of development and research and all of that? These are a long list of issues on which we hear nothing, and we want to know that at the end of the day, the threshold is going to be extremely wide. If this is not the case, we are in a very dangerous situation. We can still make it happen. I think there is a lot of importance with the event of the Prime Minister speaking in Congress, because everybody is going to listening, and this is probably going to make the case of why this is dangerous, why we should prevent extremely radical regime like Iran from having the potential to develop nuclear weapons. And not just prevent it from having them, but preventing them from having the potential to do that. But on top of that, coming back to the question you asked the audience, there are other things we can do. And I think it's not only for the Prime Minister. It's not, like fighting the Philistines in the Bible and sending David to present our case. The people of Israel should speak out. We should go to the American embassy here and protest against this dangerous move. That's what we should do. This is our fate. It's our fate. Why do we leave it only to the Prime Minister? We should have all these experts sitting here who know how dangerous the situation is, writing a paper to the president saying, listen, it's not about politics, it's about our fate. Stop it. That's what we should do. And then, if we do that, in my mind, the situation is going to change.
Thank you, Yossi. If I try to sum up the key points, you're talking about, first of all, that we have different margins of threat, I guess, Israel and the United States. And you've also raised another point that I think is quite important, that the deal that's being negotiated is not one that will mean that Iran backs away from its military nuclear aspirations, but rather it will just try to physically hold Iran back. And you're talking about vast dismantlement so that they don't have the possibility at all of moving in that direction. But before we probe that further, you want to add something?
To sum it in one sentence, the Americans were saying all along that a 1 year distance is the minimum they would have. And that would still be considered a good deal. That is better than a bad deal, so that you can go for that and not prefer a no deal. But if you look at the numbers, it's below 1 year. So if you're going to a bad deal, in spite of the fact that you're saying that the bad deal is worse than the no deal, what is the logic here?
Okay, Tamara. Maybe you can give us a little bit of the sense of the vibe sort of in Washington. Is it really that this is the U.S. perception, this is the Israeli perception, all Americans are lining up behind the U.S. perception, all Israelis, you know, or is it a little bit more complex, the picture?
Well, Emily, thanks. And first, let me say what a treat it is to be here, and to be here also with my friend Cooper, a former visiting fellow at Brookings. So nice to share the stage with you. And I would also love to hear Ray's evaluation of the premise that more effective coercion could roll the Iranian program back to zero, because that's something that Ray has written about, and I think it's a very important premise to probe. But Emily, the framing in Washington, I think, is quite different. And I certainly understand from an Israeli perspective, given the intensity and importance of the strategic relationship between the United States and Israel, why Israel looks at these negotiations through the lens of US and Iran, this dyad of US and Iran. But in Washington, I think the understanding is somewhat different. That the reason we've been able to get where we are today, the reason that we have any agreement that is in any way constraining the Iranian program, is because it's not the US versus Iran. We tried doing it unilaterally. But we've succeeded because we've been able to build an international coalition. And it's the P5+1 versus Iran in the negotiations, and it's a sanctions coalition, more importantly, that's broader than that. So I think that as the administration has looked at the process of the negotiations, and as it's looked at its strategy of coercion, it's thinking of it in terms of how to maintain that coalition. Because let's be honest, whether there's a deal or no deal, whether there's a strike or no strike, the single imperative to continue containing Iran's ambitions, and even if we roll their program back to zero, we can't roll their ambitions back to zero. The single imperative is maintaining an international consensus against Iran's ability to implement those ambitions. The sanctions coalition has been absolutely essential to the pressure that the Iranians are feeling now, the price that their economy has paid, but it has not come for free. And Dennis was deeply involved in this, getting the Chinese on board, getting them to cut back their oil purchases. They did it at some cost to themselves, because this is a huge economy that is growing fast, its demand for energy is growing fast, and we were basically saying to them, give up the advantage of this cheap and easily available source, diversify your supply. And they did that to a large extent, but there's a limit to their willingness to do it. Same thing with the Japanese, who are, of course, close partners of the United States in international security and very committed to the non-proliferation objective. They were willing to reduce their purchases of Iranian oil, even at some cost to themselves, buying at less advantageous terms from others. But there's a limit to their willingness and ability economically to do that. The United States has leveraged its large, powerful, dynamic economy with the rest of the world on behalf of the sanctions coalition. And where we are now is that we have a strong coalition, we have a consensus amongst the P5+1 on the requisites for a deal. Every day, that's costing the Iranians more. And although I feel here, being here for the last few days and talking to many Israelis over the last months, I feel the anxiety that comes from this extended uncertainty. This is dragging on, it's dragging on longer than anyone wanted. We don't know what's coming out of it, and we worry, and I get that. But time is actually on the side of the P5+1 here. And at the end of the day, if this is gonna fail, it matters tremendously how it fails. We can either let the Iranians face a tough set of choices, or face the consequences of walking away from the table, or we can make ourselves the problem. And if we do that, I think the fear is that we lose that international coalition and we lose the ability to pressure Iran, which we're gonna need to do no matter what else we do.
Thank you, Tamara. So many interesting themes are being raised, and I would like to pursue all of them. We're not gonna have enough time. We're gonna pause again for the results of the question that was asked earlier. We're pausing. Okay.
It's too late.
So I guess people are not agreeing with you, Yossi.
No, I think people should understand, first of all, that look, the Iranian project started 27 years ago. If it was not for what Israel has done throughout those 27 years, together with the Americans, I'm not underestimating what the Americans did, but if it was not for what the Israelis did,
That's fair.
then Iran would have had a weapon many years ago.
Okay, yeah, we have to wrap up. Before I ask the final question that I want to get everyone's take on, I do want to just go a little bit more into the pressure, and I agree with you. I wanted to quote actually Karim Sajjadpour, who unfortunately was not able to join us this time. He's quoted as saying, Iran does not respond to pressure, but it does respond to a lot of pressure. Would you agree to that, and how would that play out? You, Rick. Sorry.
I think our pressure strategy has focused too much on the economics, because it's the easiest form of pressure. You can manipulate the banking system and international sanctions. And there's a lot of other strategies of pressure, for instance, putting Iran on back of its heels, if it's possible, in the region, developing some sort of a political strategy. But I think relying exclusively on economic measures to a portion of the Iranian leadership, which is indifferent to that, and even welcomes being segregated from international community, has been too narrow of a focus.
Okay, we have 4.5 minutes left, so each of you will have 1 minute. I'm going to pose 2 questions, and you can choose which question you want to answer, or quickly both. The first is, we used to hear a lot of talk about the fact that at some point this dynamic will reach the point of either bombing Iran or living with the bomb. These 2 very bad options. And my question is, if there is no deal in late June, will the U.S. administration really be facing that fork in the road and that decision that needs to be made? Or in other words, this is a long way of asking, is there still a military option? Or you can answer, what do you think the chance is that in, say, 5 years, when we're sitting at the 13th annual INSS conference, our panel will be called Living in the Shadow of a Nuclear Iran. So, Dennis, please.
Look, I think that we are in a position where if there is no agreement, that we should be very careful not to accept a new normal, meaning a new normal that you simply extend the idea of the joint plan of action indefinitely, because under those circumstances, over a period of time, it'll become harder and harder to get the world to sustain the sanctions. So we do have to think about what are the ways to build the pressure on Iran. The premise of where you were, of your question to begin with, was could we, or at least what you said, could we have negotiated better? You know, obviously I think there are some other things that could have been done that would have been useful to build the pressure on the Iranians, including putting out how flexible we've been as a way of showing who has in fact been prepared to move and who hasn't, which would have suggested we were creating a context for doing a whole lot more, including even possibly the use of force in the right circumstances. I would just want to answer one thing that Yossi was raising. Yossi, you say the U.S. won't be credible even if we make these kinds of threats. Well, a couple points. One, if it's enshrined in legislation and suddenly you have the Congress and the United States on the same page, it puts things in a very different place. And the Iranians would see that as well. Secondly, it would, if you create a kind of automatic response if they carry out certain kinds of violations, it puts us in a position where we have less choice. And I would say thirdly, it also would bind the next administration that comes, all of which could have a value.
Thank you. Ray, if you want to address my question.
Are we going to be in that binary situation by June? I don't think so, by July that is. These negotiations have been going on for 13 years bilaterally, multilaterally, during, say, Jalilee's tenure extraterrestrially. They've been secret, they've been public, they have taken place in European cities of Geneva, Vienna, Brussels, Ankara, Istanbul, Moscow, Baghdad, Almaty, Oman, coming to a theater near you. The current Iranian negotiating team is the original one. It's like the reunion tool of an aging rock band. So they'll go past July if they have to. But there's a serious question that you're raising. The binary situation, living with it or bombing it. How do you know you're there? Tell me what that landscape looks like. Are we there now? Have we always been there? Does this issue susceptible to diplomatic mediation? Tell me what it looks like if I'm in that binary landscape. What are the parameters? What's the environment? What's the landscape? And if you are in that binary landscape, what are your options? Well, my options would be to extend the nuclear horizons as long as possible. That means potentially extending the JPOA as long as possible. So I think we have to kind of think about negotiations. I mean, maybe the Iranian nuclear negotiations are the second longest negotiation in the history of modern Middle East without producing a conclusive settlement. The Israeli-Palestinian are the first, always will be. Has a 40-year head start. But you got to start thinking about why we're fretting about longevity of the second longest negotiations in history of modern Middle East. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, Tamara and Yossi, you'll have the final word.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think Ray is getting to something important, which is that Iran's nuclear project is part of a broader set of regional and perhaps global ambitions. And so wherever we end up on this negotiating cycle, and whatever we do in that context, we have to look at all of Iran's behavior. Not just in order to intensify pressure for the sake of getting more concessions in the nuclear talks, but for the sake of regional stability. And I think that part of that is pushing back, which is something Dennis has suggested, although I think we might differ in how one pushes back. But part of that, too, is our security relationships with our partners in the region. And so it's important to look at this as part of a broader framework that can improve and sustain regional stability. The challenge, I think, is that as we do that, our partners, and here I think Israel is very focused on the Iranian threat, appropriately so, but our Arab partners have a set of other threats and other priorities that we have to look at as well. And so it's a very complex calculation for the United States how to engage on this in a way that over the long term enhances regional stability.
Well, first of all, I don't think that it has to go to a situation where it's either that or this. In my mind, the Iranians have a very clear understanding of the might of the United States, even of Israel. And if they would believe that there is a credible military option, they would not go to the point where they would have to really feel it. They can't be coerced, and I fully agree with Karim Sajadpour in saying that they do understand very strong pressure. They did it in 1988, they did it in 2003, they did it in 2012, by the way. They were speaking about planting mines in the Hormuz Straits. The moment the administration on that approached them and told them, don't even think about it, they said, oh, well, this was, we were mistaken to speak about this, we forgot it already. They know very well how strong the United States is. And in my mind, they're not going to test it. But what they see is lack of readiness by the United States to really treat this matter as something real. That's the problem. They don't believe the Americans mean it. They know they can, but they don't believe they won't. And that's why they keep moving forward. And that's why they eventually, in 5 years, if nothing changes, yes, we might have here a nuclear Iran, if nothing changes. And all these games in adopting all kinds of resolutions, if this is going to be considered as something real, they would be impressed. If this is going to be considered as a way to bypass the problem, they're not going to be impressed. And so the context is extremely important. And also, coming back, I think it's this high noon situation is not only about Iran. I think Tamara is very much has a very strong point here. It's about the entire attitude of the West to what's happening in the Middle East. It's about the entire attitude of the people of the Middle East about what's happening in the Middle East. All comes down to the same issue of Iran. How are we going to treat Iran? This is the litmus test for the readiness of the West to treat seriously the situation in the Middle East. That's what's at stake. And it's extremely interesting. It just happens to fall incidentally with the elections of Israel, but this decision is critical for years in the future. It's so important.
Thank you very much. We could have continued for a long time. A round of applause for this panel. Thank you.